Eddie Jones, widowed 22 months, pulled light bulbs from his F-150 on a crisp autumn morning in Claremont, Pennsylvania. Driving to the yellow house on Birch Street made sense because Ruth Calloway's newspaper arrived at 7 and she liked company. He knew exactly who Ruth Calloway was, the widow of the man who founded the company that fired him. Visiting every morning for 14 months was because she was alone and he owed something to what Carl built. He didn't know that her granddaughter, the CEO who signed his termination in 11 minutes, visited every other weekend and was about to walk through that same kitchen door. And he definitely didn't know the only printed copy of the safety report that could have stopped what was coming had been buried in Ruth's recipe drawer since September, when Araya's hospital configuration failed during a live demo with 60 people watching the queue freeze. Eddie was the only man in the building who knew the sequence to bring it back. 22 minutes. The woman handing him the badge was the same woman who had signed his name off the system 14 months ago. If you love stories about the quiet professional who takes the hit and is the only one who can step in when the system collapses, settle in. I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. Eddie was standing in the cold shade of a commercial loading alley behind the Claremont Hotel, tracing a fault in an exterior breaker box. It was 7:15 on a Tuesday morning. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and damp brick. He held a multimeter in his left hand, probing the scorched contacts of a 200-amp main breaker that had tripped and refused to reset. The copper dust from the old wiring settled into the creases of his forearms, a familiar residue from the kind of work that kept him moving and kept him quiet. He had been working on the circuit for 40 minutes, the morning quiet broken only by the metallic click of his wire strippers. He was testing the voltage drop across the neutral bar when a side door from the hotel lobby opened. Craig Dunmore walked out into the alley wearing a charcoal suit that fit with the unquestioned precision of 20 years in corporate operations. Behind him came Gerald Voss and Malin Park, Orvex Capital observers, dressed in the kind of quiet clothing that never announces its cost. They were cutting through the alley for the short walk to the Meridian campus. Craig was speaking as they entered, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who controlled every room he walked into. Eddie kept his multimeter probes on the contacts. He did not turn around, but Craig's footsteps stopped directly behind him. "Well," Craig said, "looks like you found your level." 7 words. The institutional dismissal of a man reduced to alley work. Eddie finished reading the meter display before he turned, meeting Craig's eyes for exactly as long as it took to register the tailored suit and the 2 observers standing 3 steps behind him. "You've got a 200-amp service trying to pull 300 amps because someone daisy-chained the new lobby compressors to the old service circuit," Eddie said, his voice entirely flat. "Tell the hotel manager to look at the scorch marks on the bus bar before they try resetting this." He delivered the technical observation without inflection, the way a man reads a serial number. He turned back to the breaker box, adjusting his grip on the probes. Craig stood still for a half-second before steering the observers toward the street. As they passed, Gerald Voss glanced at Eddie, a quick, neutral assessment from a man who recognized competence when he heard it. The yellow house on Birch Street was a cheerful, peeling shade that Ruth Calloway had been meaning to repaint for years. Eddie carried a grocery bag and a box of light bulbs up the front steps, letting himself in through the unlocked door. Ruth Calloway treated him like family, offering an unbroken stream of conversation that didn't require him to answer. She was the widow of the man who built Meridian, but to Eddie, she was just the person who needed her sink fixed and her light bulbs changed. Penny sat at the kitchen table drawing with colored pencils on the back of a work order. She was using a laminated rectangle as a straight edge, an ID card Eddie recognized from across the room. He set the groceries down and walked over. Penny did not look up. Eddie picked up the card. It was a piece of white plastic showing his 33-year-old face and the old Meridian logo stitched over his heart. He looked at it for one beat, then set it back on the table, face down. He walked to the sink without a word. Nearby, Ruth was shifting items in the everything drawer, batteries, pharmacy receipts, a Hershey magnet, a blueberry buckle recipe. To make room for the new batteries, she pulled out a piece of paper covered in numbers. She set it face down on the counter. It stayed there for the rest of the morning. Eddie knelt to work on the kitchen faucet. He had the cartridge out in under a minute when Penny spoke. She had a way of watching the world that made adults nervous. She didn't ask many questions, but the ones she did ask usually landed with a precision that Eddie recognized as his own. Why do you check it 3 times after it's already fixed? Eddie tightened the packing nut, tested the handle, and tightened it again. Because sometimes a seal looks right until you put pressure on it. The first check tells you it's seated. The second check tells you it's seated under load. The third check tells you it's going to stay that way. Fixing something isn't just about making it work today, Eddie added, wiping his hands on a rough cloth. It's about making sure the next person who relies on it doesn't have to worry. That's the job. You don't leave traps for other people. Penny was quiet. Is that why you check on me 3 times before you leave in the morning? Eddie's hands stopped. He held the wrench still for a moment longer than necessary. Then he tightened the nut one final time and stood up. Go wash your hands. The F-150 smelled of coffee and the faint residue of PVC cement. Eddie drove with one hand on the wheel, taking the long route to his next job. It passed the industrial park where Meridian Automation Solutions had its loading dock. The dock was active. A forklift was moving pallets off 3 flatbed trucks. Eddie recognized the equipment instantly, heavy-duty MedSim load testing rigs. He had designed the MedSim integration for AIRA's hospital configuration. Those rigs were not used for standard sales presentations. They were only rolled out when an acquiring firm demanded a live technical due diligence stress test, pushing the system above 85% sustained load. He knew what the hardware meant. Craig was planning a full-load due diligence demo to impress Orvex Capital, and they were going to hit the 160-millisecond handshake delay that he had documented 14 months ago. Eddie watched the MedSim rigs disappear in the rearview mirror. He did not touch the brake. He did not call anyone. But as he drove past the building where he had spent 11 years of his life, his grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles went white against the leather. The following Saturday morning found Eddie kneeling on Ruth Calloway's linoleum floor, his tools spread in the careful pattern of a man who had learned to trust order over memory. The thermostat on the wall read 68 degrees, which was correct for the season and the hour, and he had already verified it once against his own thermometer. He checked it again anyway, the way a person checks a locked door before leaving a house he will not return to for a long time. The kitchen was warm with the smell of coffee and something Ruth had baked the night before. A scent that clung to the yellow walls and the worn linoleum and the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Sunlight came through the window above the sink, falling across the counter where a piece of paper sat face down, covered in numbers that meant nothing to anyone who had not written them. Diana arrived through the front door without knocking, carrying a bag of groceries and the leather satchel, dressed in clothes that belonged to a different world than the one her grandmother inhabited. The door clicked shut behind her, and she walked through the narrow hallway into the kitchen, where she stopped. Eddie was on one knee beside the wall, a screwdriver in his hand, his work boots planted flat on the yellow linoleum. He looked up when her shadow crossed the floor. Diana looked down at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ruth was at the counter peeling an apple in a long, continuous ribbon. "Oh, good, you're both here." "Diana, this is Eddie. He's been helping me with the house." "Eddie, this is my granddaughter." "Diana." She said it with the warmth of a woman who saw only what was in front of her, which was a man fixing her thermostat and her granddaughter visiting for the weekend. Diana's face did not change. Eddie's did not change. But the air in the small kitchen shifted, and Eddie felt it settle around him like a weight he had been carrying for 14 months and had not put down. Diana set the grocery bag on the counter. "Hello." Her voice was measured, carrying the professional neutrality of someone who had learned to keep her reactions off her face. Eddie nodded. "Mommy." He turned back to the thermostat, tightening the faceplate screws with the deliberate precision of a man who had once built machines that cost more than this house was worth. The phone rang. Diana pulled it from her pocket, glanced at the screen, and her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She stepped into the hallway, not far enough to be out of earshot, just far enough to be out of sight. Eddie kept his hands on the thermostat, but he did not need to see her face to hear the shift in her voice when she answered. The corporate cadence settled over her words like a coat she put on for weather she did not like. "I understand," she said. "No, I'm at my grandmother's. I can review the numbers this evening." A pause. "Yes, I'm aware of the timeline." Another pause, longer. "I said I understand, Craig." The name landed in the kitchen. Eddie's hands did not stop moving, but his fingers found the next screw without looking for it. Diana came back into the kitchen. Her face had changed. Something had been added to it, or something had been taken away, and the result was a woman standing in her grandmother's kitchen who looked smaller than she had when she walked in. "Everything all right?" Ruth asked. "Fine," Diana said. "Work." Eddie stood up, brushing off his knees. He was packing his tools into the leather pouch, moving with the economy of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Diana watched his hands. She watched the way he placed each tool into its slot without looking, the way his fingers found the right compartment by touch alone. She leaned against the counter. Her hand brushed against the piece of paper that had been sitting there all morning. She picked it up, turned it over. The Meridian Automation Solutions header was at the top, blue ink on white paper. Below it, a name, E. Jones. Below that, a date, 9/14. Diana held the paper for one breath. Her hand did not tremble. Her face did not change, but something in her posture shifted. A stillness that was not quite stillness. The way a person holds still when they are trying not to break something they have just picked up. Ruth's voice cut through the silence. "The good china is in the top cabinet, dear. Could you reach it for me? My shoulder has been acting up." Diana set the paper down, face down, exactly as she had found it. She walked to the cabinet and opened it without looking back. Eddie finished packing his tools. He stood by the door, his hand on the knob. "The thermostat is set," he said to Ruth. "Call me if it drifts." "Thank you, Eddie." Ruth smiled at him, the warm, uncomplicated smile of a woman who saw only what was in front of her. Eddie nodded at Diana. She nodded back. Neither of them said anything else. He closed the door behind him. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Diana stood in front of the open cabinet, her hand on a plate she was not looking at. "Did you know him before?" Ruth asked. Diana set the plate on the counter. "No," she said. "I didn't." She pulled out her phone and called Craig back. He answered on the first ring. "Diana, tell me about the consortium demo." There was a pause on the other end. When Craig spoke, his voice carried an edge that had nothing to do with the words themselves. "Full capability. That's what we're showing them. Everything Aria can do." "Full capability," Diana repeated. The words felt wrong in her mouth, but she could not say why. "The board wants to see what we've built," Craig said, "and I intend to show them." The line went quiet. Diana stood in her grandmother's kitchen, the phone still in her hand, the paper still face down on the counter. The phrase "full capability" echoed in the small space, carrying an edge that had nothing to do with corporate pride and everything to do with a man waiting for something to break. She did not know what he was planning for the consortium demo, but for the first time, she felt the distinct chill of standing on the tracks. The morning came to Ruth's yellow kitchen the way it always did, with the smell of percolated coffee and the sound of a radio tuned to a station that played songs from before Eddie was born. He sat at the small table with a mug in his hands, waiting for the coffee to cool. Ruth moved between the counter and the stove with the unhurried rhythm of a woman who had been making breakfast for other people for most of her life. She set a plate of toast in front of him and refilled her own cup. "Diana has been so stressed lately," Ruth said, buttering her toast with careful attention. "A big technical due diligence stress test for the acquisition," she said. "They're bringing in the Orvex auditors and everyone who matters." Eddie took a sip of his coffee. His face did not change, and his hand did not move differently. But inside, the pieces slid together exactly the way they used to when he sat in a room full of engineers who were looking at the wrong problem. The medsim rigs he had seen on the loading dock combined with a live due diligence test meant they would run the full suite at maximum capacity. They would run it with the 160 millisecond handshake still in place. That was the timing he had flagged in the original design review because it created a cumulative latency failure at 87% load sustained for 14 seconds. He knew the number because he had calculated it. He knew the failure mode because he had written the note that no one read. Eddie finished his coffee, set the mug in the sink, and walked out to his truck. Across town, Diana sat at her glass-top desk in an office that was too quiet for its size. The morning light fell across the surface in a long rectangle she kept clear of everything except her phone and a single pen. She picked up the phone and dialed the HR director's extension. Patricia. Diana. I need you to pull a file for me. She waited through the pause on the other end. The complete original termination documentation for Eddie Jones, Diana said. Every timestamp, every note, every access log. Grant my CEO account read access to his sealed file on the internal HR portal immediately. Another pause followed. Patricia asked the question Diana had expected. Because I am the CEO, Diana said, and I am asking you to do this without involving anyone else in operations. Do I have the access? Patricia confirmed she would provision it, though the hesitation in her voice made it clear that bypassing Craig Dunmore was not something anyone at Meridian did lightly. Thank you. Diana hung up and looked at the rectangle of light on her desk. The hope she felt was a fragile thing, a small flicker of something she did not trust. If the file had been sealed rather than closed, she had the authority to reopen it. She could ask the questions she had not asked 14 months ago. She picked up her pen and set it down again. That evening, Eddie stood at the open bed of his truck outside the storage unit he had rented the week after he was fired. The air smelled of dust and old metal. The storage unit itself held nothing else of value, just boxes of clothes that Lorraine used to wear and a few pieces of furniture that didn't fit in the apartment. He reached in and pulled out a locked hard case. The latches were dull with age. He had not opened it in 22 months. He set it on the tailgate and worked the combination from memory. The latches clicked open. Inside lay diagnostic cables and a standalone terminal unit from his engineering days. The screen was dark and the ports clean. The device had been packed with the same care he used to pack everything when he left Meridian. Precisely, deliberately, with no room for error. Eddie pulled out the first cable and examined the pins with one slow, methodical pass of his fingers. He pulled out the second cable and checked it the same way. The terminal power booted perfectly when he pressed the button on the side. He turned it off and tested it again. Then he tested it a third time. Closing the case, he latched it and set it on the passenger seat of his truck. He did not explain to anyone what he was doing because he did not need to. Back at Meridian, Diana sat at her desk in the dark. The building was quiet around her. She had her laptop screen angled toward her, refreshing the internal HR portal. Access denied. She closed the tab, then opened it to try again. The permissions from Patricia had not cleared yet, but they had to. Diana leaned back in her chair and looked out at the empty office park below. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the asphalt. Somewhere across town, Eddie was moving through his own preparations. She did not know that he had opened the locked case or that he had checked the pins 3 times. She did not know he was driving home with a terminal unit beside him, but the pieces were finally moving, the long silence breaking at last, and neither of them knew it was already too late. Craig called on Thursday morning, not from his office, but from the hallway outside it, where the acoustics carried his voice in a way that made it sound casual and unhurried. Diana took the call standing at her desk, one hand resting on the edge of the glass, and she listened to him describe what he had noticed. A board member, he said, had mentioned seeing her car parked outside a residential address in the southeast part of town on 2 separate evenings. The board member was not concerned, Craig explained carefully. He was simply curious, and Craig had told him it was nothing. A personal errand, a friend, something that did not warrant further attention. But Craig wanted her to know that people were watching, the way people always watched a CEO who went off script, and that he would hate to see her reputation damaged by something that looked like an investigation into a terminated employee when it was probably nothing at all. Diana listened, She did not ask how Craig knew it was a terminated employee's address because she already understood. There were no automated alerts for sealed files. Craig knew because Patricia had called him the moment Diana made the request. He had waited until morning to use it. She thanked him for letting her know. She hung up. She stood at her desk for a long moment, looking at the rectangle of morning light. When she called Patricia back, the HR director immediately offered an excuse about archival retrieval taking 24 hours. Diana did not argue. Her voice was steady when she thanked Patricia and closed the request. The way a person's voice stays steady when they realize the door they hope to open is being held shut from the other side. But she did not sit down. Realizing Craig had stonewalled her through HR, she escalated. She called the security office and issued a visitor pass for Eddie Jones, effective immediately, under CEO authority. No procurement, no HR paperwork. A visitor pass required only her name and her signature, and she provided both. Then she called Eddie and asked him to attend the consortium demonstration as an independent observer. She did not explain what she meant by independent, and he did not ask. The glass-walled conference room held 60 people at 1:15 that afternoon. Dr. Abernathy sat at the center of the long table with 4 board members arranged around her like a formation. Gerald Voss and Mei Lin Park from Orvex Capital occupied the far end, their laptops open and their faces unreadable. The Meridian engineering team stood at the terminals along the sidewall, and Craig moved through the room the way a host moved through a party, touching shoulders, offering quiet explanations, managing the space. Eddie stood at the back of the room with a visitor badge clipped to his collar. He had not spoken to anyone since he arrived. He watched the main display as the ARIA hospital configuration loaded, and he watched the load metrics climb past the safety threshold that should have been in place. The safety cap was gone. Craig had ordered a full capability demonstration, and the system was running at production-grade load with nothing between it and failure. The override command queue froze at 1:23. The medical equipment emulators went red on the screens. First 1, then 3, then a cascade of them, and the room became noise. Gerald Voss was already on his phone, speaking in low, rapid sentences. Dr. Abernathy turned to the Meridian engineering lead and asked a question that did not receive an answer. The board members turned to Diana, and Craig stepped into the space between them and said, his voice carrying exactly the right note of concern, "This is exactly why we need operational stability." The engineering team stood frozen at their terminals, their hands resting on keyboards they did not know how to use. Eddie watched the queue depth climb on the display. He knew what it meant. He knew what it would do in 14 more seconds, and then in 12, and then in 10. He knew the flush sequence that would clear it, because he had written it. He had written it in a language the current team had never been trained to read. He stepped forward. Craig saw him move and turned, his voice cutting through the noise. "Former employee, this room isn't for him." Diana walked to the demo terminal. She pointed at the Meridian IT director, whose hands were hovering over a frozen keyboard. "Authenticate the terminal with your admin credentials and step aside," she ordered. Her voice cut through the chaos, carrying the full weight of executive authority. "Let him work." The IT director hesitated, looked at Craig, then back at Diana. He entered his MFA sequence and stepped away. Diana did not look at Craig. She did not look at the board. She looked at Eddie and nodded once. Eddie sat down at the unlocked terminal. The noise continued around him. Dr. Abernathy was demanding timelines. Voss was still on his phone. Craig was still speaking, still managing, still framing, but Eddie was the single still point in the room, the way a gear is still when everything around it is in motion. And he worked. 22 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not look up. He spent the first 30 seconds writing an automated loop script to dump the queue and keep the system breathing. Then he spent the next 21 minutes forensically isolating the handshake protocol and surgically rewriting the buffer limits in the configuration to force stabilize the demo environment. The queue depth fell. The displays went green. The medical emulators returned to their normal state, and the room went quiet in a different way. Eddie turned the terminal screen toward Dr. Abernathy and the QA director. "The full command log is open," he said. "Every keystroke I entered is visible. You can audit the loop script and the buffer rewrite now." Dr. Abernathy looked at the log. She looked at Eddie. She looked at Craig, who had stopped speaking. She pulled a notepad from her jacket and began to write. And the way she wrote was not the way a person writes when they are impressed. It was the way a person writes when they are documenting failures. Undocumented recovery procedures. Single point of failure dependency. No change control audit trail for the handshake modification. She filled a page, then turned it and filled another. Eddie came home at 11:30 that night. The apartment was dark except for the lamp near the armchair, and Penny was asleep in it, her head tilted against the wingback, her breathing slow and even. A half-finished drawing lay on the armrest beside her, 4 figures at a table, and the ID card lay beside it, the ruler she had been using when sleep caught up to her. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long time. She opened her eyes the way children do, without transition, simply awake. She looked at him. She picked up the ED card and held it out to him the way she handed him everything, without asking, without speaking, just the motion. He took it. He held it face up this time, and he looked at the name on it. The name that belonged to a man who had spent 22 minutes in a glass room surrounded by 60 people who would now become an investigation. Diana had used executive authority to put a terminated employee on an admin terminal in front of the board. Craig was already framing the narrative. Dr. Abernathy was building a compliance case that would trigger a federal audit, and all Eddie had left was a piece of plastic in his hand that belonged to a man who did not exist anymore. He sat down on the edge of the coffee table. Penny watched him. She did not ask anything. She simply waited, the way she always did, and Eddie held the card the way a person holds something they do not know how to put down. The demo room had gone quiet in a way that was different from the silence of a working system. It was the quiet of people who had watched something happen that they did not fully understand and were waiting to see what would happen next. The display showed green across the board. The QDEF held steady below 60%. The medical equipment emulators ran their test cycles without interruption, and the only sound was the low hum of the cooling fans and the occasional tap of a keyboard from the Meridian engineering lead, who was still verifying that the system was stable. Eddie stood 3 feet back from the terminal he had used. He had not touched it since the flush sequence completed. The full command log was still open on the display, every keystroke visible, every action time-stamped and auditable. And he had folded his arms the way a person folds his arms when he has finished what he came to do and is waiting for someone else to decide what comes next. Dr. Abernathy closed her notepad. She did not look at Eddie. She looked at the board members who had remained in the room, and she spoke in a voice that carried the weight of someone who had seen enough to form a conclusion and was now deciding how to act on it. "I am requesting an independent technical review of all ARIA safety documentation before any contract proceeds," she said. "My concern is not whether this man is impressive. My concern is why this company has zero institutional resilience." She did not say it loudly. She did not need to. The words sat in the air the way a document sits on a table when everyone knows what it contains. The audit committee chair, a man whose name Eddie had never learned and whose face he had seen only in photographs from annual reports, caught Diana's eye from across the room. He glanced at Craig, who was standing near the far wall with his phone in his hand, and then he said one sentence, quietly enough that most of the room did not hear it. "Executive session. Now, freeze all operations level server access." Diana nodded. She did not look at Craig. She looked at Eddie and she said, "You come with me." Eddie followed her out of the demo room. He did not look back at the glass walls or the displays or the 60 people who were still standing and the aftermath of what he had done. He walked the way a person walks when he has stopped deciding where to go and has simply let someone else lead. Behind them, in the demo room, Gerald Voss closed his laptop. He caught Maylin Park's eye across the room. They did not speak. They did not nod. They simply collected their materials, stood, and walked out of the room without a word to anyone. No goodbye to Craig. No explanation. The door closed behind them, and the sound of it was the sound of a door that does not need to be opened again. The executive boardroom was a different kind of space from the demo room. The demo room was glass and light and the hum of equipment. This room was wood and silence and the weight of a door that had been closed. The table was long and polished, and the chairs were the kind of chairs that a person sits in when they are about to hear something they do not want to hear. The audit committee chair stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He pointed at the chief compliance officer. "Project the ARIA safety flag archive on the main display," he ordered. The officer typed, and the screen glowed blue with the interface that Eddie had not seen in 14 months. The list of flags appeared, sorted by status. Diana stepped forward. She had not come into this room blind. Earlier that morning, when Patricia had stalled the HR file, Diana had used her CEO credentials to pull the engineering safety archive. The one system Patricia could not block. She already knew exactly what the screen would show. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a document. It was a printout slightly curled at the edges, with a coffee ring on page 3 that had dried to a pale brown crescent. It had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases had gone soft. She placed it on the polished table, and the contrast between the paper and the wood was the contrast between a kitchen drawer and a boardroom, between a woman who had kept a document for 14 months and the company that had buried it. "Cross-reference the flag ID on this document," Diana said, her voice steady, with the record currently sitting in under review status in the archive. The audit committee chair did not ask why. He did not ask where the document had come from. He nodded to the compliance officer, who entered the flag ID from the printout into the archive search. The system returned the result in less than a second. Same flag ID, same author, E. Jones. Same date filed, September 14. Same failure mode. Same recommended patch. Same handshake protocol named by number. 14 months unresolved. The room was quiet for a long moment. Diana picked up the printout. She read from it the way a person reads something she has read so many times that she no longer needs to see the words. She read the failure mode aloud. She read the patch protocol. She read the handshake protocol number. And then she set the paper down and said what she had come to say. 14 months ago, I made a decision that I believed was in the best interest of operational stability. I terminated an employee based on a recommendation I did not verify. I took 11 minutes to make that decision, and I did not read the safety flag that was sitting in the system. That is my responsibility. I am not assigning blame elsewhere. I am telling you what I did. She paused. She did not look at Craig. She did not need to. The room turned to Eddie. He was standing near the wall, in the work clothes he had worn to the demo room. The same clothes he had worn to work every day for the 12 years he had worked here. Before he had been walked out the door with his ID card in his hand. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood the way a person stands when they have been waiting for something for a long time and it has finally arrived. The audit committee chair looked at Craig. "Can you explain?" he said, his voice carrying no accusation, only the weight of a question that required an answer. "Why this flag has been under review for 14 months. Craig opened his mouth. The warm voice started to form, the voice that had carried him through 100 meetings and 1,000 conversations, the voice that could make a delay sound like prudence and a failure sound like progress. But it did not come out the way it usually did. It came out thinner, the way a voice sounds when the person speaking it knows that the room is no longer listening to the tone but to the content. And the content was not there. He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. He simply stopped, and the room watched him stop. And that was the end of it. The audit committee chair turned back to Eddie. "Do you have anything to say?" Eddie was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was the same voice he had used in the demo room. Calm and measured and carrying no more than what the words required. "What I did in the demo room was a hot fix loop script. It is a tourniquet, not a cure. The permanent fix requires a firmware recompile in the lab and validation on 3 test rigs, which will take 3 weeks. After that, deployment to the live hospital servers will require a scheduled 40-minute downtime window. He paused. He did not look at Craig. He did not look at the board members. He looked at the display, at the flag that had sat unresolved for 14 months, and he said, "I will write the full hot fix procedure and the permanent fix procedure into the official documentation. I will train the current engineering team on both. We build these systems to protect people who will never know our names. When you cut a corner to save a fraction of a second or a line in a budget, you decide that your convenience is worth more than their safety. I won't be part of that. No single person ever needs to be in this room again for this reason." The room absorbed what he had said. He had not asked for an apology. He had not listed what had been taken from him. He had not demanded recognition. He had described the work that needed to be done and offered to do it. And the offer was not the offer of a man who wanted something. It was the offer of a man who had already finished wanting. The executive session did not last much longer after that. The audit committee chair closed the archive display. He looked at the printout on the table, the coffee ring, the curled edges, the document that had traveled from a kitchen drawer to a boardroom table. He looked at Diana, who had placed it there. He looked at Eddie, who had not asked for anything. Eddie was standing. Diana was standing. Craig was not. The Carl Calloway Safety Review Protocol moved through the board approval chain without resistance. Nobody wanted to question a procedure named for the founder. Every priority one safety flag would now be reviewed by an outside engineering board before internal recommendation to HR. SFR 914 was the first case it covered retroactively. When Diana told her the name of the new protocol, Ruth smiled without speaking. Eddie accepted the formal record correction and the back pay. He declined the full-time position. He would not work for free, but he would not surrender his freedom. Instead, as the only architect capable of saving the acquisition, he demanded a fixed bid, independent contract. For $450,000, paid across 3 months, Eddie would rebuild the core architecture, write the complete documentation, and train the current engineering team. He protected his self-respect and earned enough to cover Penny's next decade of expenses. The offer he had made in the demo room, so no single person ever needed to be in that room again for that reason, became real, strictly on his terms. The morning after the executive session, the audit committee suspended Craig Dunmore without pay. Security escorted him from the building. The confiscation of his laptop, badge, and server access took 11 minutes, mirroring exactly the exit he had given Eddie 14 months earlier. A targeted forensic accounting review of his cost reduction decisions began immediately. It would take months of subpoenas and Big Four auditors to finally unearth Dunco Consulting LLC in the budget lines, leading to formal termination and a referral to the state attorney general. But Craig's institutional power ended the exact moment he was walked to the parking lot. Eddie's hands remained clean. The system found it, not Eddie. In the weeks after the demo, independent investigators visited the yellow house on Birch Street. Ruth gave her statement in precise cursive. The retired schoolteacher documented her exact memory of Eddie filling out a paper on September 23 and what he had told her when she asked about it. "Just old paperwork, Miss Ruth. Nothing important." The statement independently confirmed the timeline and became part of the formal record. She had tossed the paper into her junk drawer and held it for 14 months, precisely because he had protected her from knowing what it was. And now she knew. Saturday morning arrived months later. Diana took the train from the city. She carried a box of pastries from the bakery near the station. She did not have a work excuse. There was no urgent board matter to discuss, no corporate agenda to manage, and no one from operations tracking her calendar. This was not the first Saturday, but it was early enough that no one had named what it was. Ruth pretended not to notice that Diana was early. Eddie pretended not to notice that she intended to stay. The fourth chair at the kitchen table was no longer empty. Penny had claimed it. On the table in front of Penny was the old ID card. She was using it as a straightedge for her colored pencils, drawing a line across a blank sheet of paper. Diana noticed it. She reached out and touched the edge of the plastic. She read the title line, then let her hand fall away. The card remained face up on the table between Eddie and Diana. It had lost its power to hurt. On the refrigerator, held by a gear-shaped magnet, was Penny's drawing. 4 figures sat at a table. She had drawn it before any of the adults had made a decision. Diana held her coffee cup in both hands. She looked at the drawing, then at Eddie, then at the card on the table. "How do I know this will actually work?" Diana asked. Eddie met her eyes. "I'll check it 3 times. He let a beat pass. "I always do." The mechanical answer had become a promise of personal fidelity. They sat in the quiet warmth of the morning. Ruth's coffee was cooling because she kept forgetting to drink it, and neither of them reminded her.